Nicole Boygiova, Artist Talk. Over the course of the past few years, I found myself inadvertently creating works with a similar aesthetic pattern. Despite responding to different stimuli, I found myself drawn to repetitive forms and shapes, specifically abstracted organic networks with few harsh lines and a recurrence of areas of negative space. I was curious to explore this seemingly innate visual language I had subconsciously fostered, as I think all artists have an aesthetic fingerprint, or something akin to a genetic code, that guides their work, and I wanted to make an effort to sequence mine. Last summer, I visited the Magura cave in Bulgaria in an attempt to see some of the oldest Neolithic drawings in the area. This sparked an avenue of research, as despite being the only surviving drawings in the area, the shapes resembled drawings from other images of Neolithic art I had seen. As the diagram shows, there seems to be some constants and visual languages across Neolithic cultures which had developed entirely independently. Not only this, but the act of leaving marks within caves is a universal marker of any early civilization, pointing to the innate human need to leave one's mark, communicate, and essentially make art. And so I wanted to explore the grounds of concept abstraction, as well as the fabric of my own aesthetic language. As both my points of interest were centered around an innate drive, I decided to focus on creating a collection of pieces that showcase the product of automatic processes. In order to do so, I chose a format that allows shape and form to take center stage. With a minimal palette and set dimensions, I aimed to illustrate in full the shapes and structures that appealed to me. The resulting shapes, or glyphs, seem to scratch a brain itch as they tread the line between familiar forms and abstract symbols. However, I did make an active effort to balance detail with simplicity in order to make forms that are unique without overcomplicated the line work, so that they remain readable as glyphs but can exist as minimalist paintings in themselves. To maintain the balance between abstract and familiar, I expanded my research to a variety of organic forms. Visiting the Anatomy Museum allowed me to explore shapes in the body which I had not previously seen presented in such a way. I was drawn to certain visual motifs, which I had developed into several glyphs as shown here. As with my prior work, I am continuing to explore shapes of negative space, as seen with the gaps in the left pelvis, the holes in the sacrum, and the space created by the interlocking bones of the spine. After beginning my collection of glyphs inspired by forms I had encountered, I wanted to apply them to an environment where I could test their ability to exist as standalone pieces. Specifically, I wanted to see if they have an aesthetic weight to compare to the Neolithic examples of glyphs, and I wanted to see how a cave landscape would impact the way in which these forms are read. I projected the glyphs on the walls of Wallace's cave in Ralston Glen, and I played around with how the texture of the walls distorted the structure of the glyphs and disrupted their readability, thus transforming them into purely abstract shapes. It also allowed me to compare the weight and impact of individual glyphs against each other, and this series of photos show how effective one particular glyph is in comparison to the rest of them. Its collection of limbs give the impression of a creature crawling on the walls of the cave. I particularly enjoyed how these images showcase the way in which the glyph comes to life in certain positions and orientation, and how being positioned on the back of the wall as opposed to perhaps the side changes its character from brooding to inquisitive, giving it a dynamic anthropomorphic quality. While some of the glyphs I made were informed by sketches and research, I wanted to focus on automatism and exploring my personal visual language. Inspired by the Nazca lines in the Nazca Desert, I used a drone to film the lines I created when running on a beach. The scale allowed me to disconnect from the outcome while still allowing myself to channel forms and shapes innate to the way I draw. I focused on speed and movement to create a series of drawings, which in turn I used to inform the next set of glyphs I made. The full video can also be found on my research report and in my portfolio. From this experimentation, I discovered that I tend to produce drawings that are comprised of a series of tubes which seem to taper off into blobs. I push this motif in as many ways as possible, and I am particularly intrigued by its recurrence in my work, which seems to happen both consciously and unconsciously. In some of my earlier glyphs, I had created shapes that resembled cell structures, as I played with a combination of circular forms and negative space. After much back and forth with the biology department, I was able to borrow a microscope, which allowed me to do my own research and gain an understanding of what my own cells look like. I played around with several techniques, sample types, and image manipulations, and I was particularly intrigued by how much the orientation of my cells changed with each sample, as the vibrancy, lines, and coagulation varied massively and produced beautifully different results, which in turn informed more glyphs. After looking at cells with the microscope, I used the weaker strength to have a look at some other structures, most of which were not as interesting by comparison. However, the lines of my fingerprints appealed to my quite linear way of appreciating shapes. In a similar thought process, I noticed the logo of a coffee shop, which resembles a glyph in its minimalist linear form. I was intrigued by the fact that in resembling the contours of a mountain, the design communicates so much information about the brand, its origin, its ethos, and its cultural ties, etc. And so I decided to explore the possibility of extracting and compiling my own contour maps to use in my work, based off of the mountain regions my ancestors are from. The similarities in concentric line patterns, despite the vast difference in scale, led me to exhibit the fingerprints and contour maps together, as well as using the pair of prints to inform even more glyphs. In researching Neolithic art, and the work of Christoph Menke was particularly important, specifically his discussion surrounding the emergence of self-portraiture in Neolithic glyphs. I was particularly intrigued by the idea of alternative modes of self-portraiture which highlight alternative beauty, such as in the form of abstract symbols used by early man. I collated aerial and microscopic images I had taken and arranged an installation in which I treated the images like wallet keepsakes, allowing me to play with the idea of self-portraiture in showcasing my constituent parts, from my individual cells to the mountains my ancestors lived in. The collection of images as self-portraiture could be seen as encompassing, all-encompassing but also absurd, another dichotomy I enjoyed playing with. As my collection grew, informed by various experiments I had been undertaking, a new distinct visual language began to emerge. The glyphs started to self-inform the direction of my painting. As the more glyphs I made, the more particular the specifications became for a glyph to seem like a coherent member of the collection. The glyphs I presented at the MAFA show, for example, showcase this, as I've had to remove several glyphs in order to maintain the harmony of the collection. The glyph circled I decided is too heavy, with uncharacteristic solid black areas which make contact with the borders, which as I made more glyphs I realized made this work unfit for the collection. Using this method of self-informing with external research, I completed my collection of 121 glyphs. My next challenge was how to apply them in a way which allows them to be as readable and engaging to the viewer as possible, a universal linguistic question with any set of symbols. My aims are making a garment which, in wearing fabric printed with glyphs, the glyphs are presented as coexisting with or being embodied by the body. As most of my inspiration for the collection has been anatomical or organic, I would like to involve the body in as many ways as possible to push my work as multidimensional. Playing with different garment patterns and fabrics will hopefully allow me to find the most effective results. I would also like to create a shorthand informed by calligraphic practices, which would allow glyphs a new dimension of readability and would allow me to focus on more automatic processes and the importance of movement in drawing once again. My ultimate goal, however, is to give the glyphs a voice in order to realize my work as an imagined linguistic system. By using a reverse spectrogram, I am able to input my glyphs into a program which outputs a resulting sound based on the arrangements of the pixels in each glyph. And this is what this glyph would sound like. I am hoping to play around with these sounds and make them slightly more palatable by tracking high and low points in each sound and using this auditory punctuation to inform new work, which will allow me to sequence the audios and build a track from a written text of glyphs, like a reading accompaniment.